What happens when the ultimate betrayal becomes the ultimate blessing? Two struggling orphans were written out of their wealthy family's fortune, left with nothing but a toxic, rusted junkyard. But their arrogant relatives made one fatal mistake. They didn't look underneath the scrap. This is a story of vengeance and billions. The air inside the mahogany-paneled office of Harrison and Associates was stifling, smelling faintly of expensive floor wax and old paper. Outside, the November wind howled through the streets of Denver, Colorado, rattling the thick glass windows, but inside the boardroom, the chill was entirely human. Arthur and Leo Sullivan sat shoulder to shoulder on a leather sofa that felt far too plush for their current reality. At 23, the twins possessed the same sharp jawline and unruly dark hair, but the similarities ended there. Arthur, the pragmatist, sat with his hands tightly clasped, his knuckles white. Leo, a volatile spark plug of a young man, practically vibrated with anxious, defensive energy. Both wore heavily washed denim jackets and boots that had seen better days, a stark contrast to the man sitting across from them. Their uncle, Richard Sullivan, adjusted the cuffs of his bespoke charcoal suit. He didn't look like a man who was mourning the sudden fiery car crash that had claimed his brother's life just 3 weeks prior. He looked like a corporate shark waiting for the dinner bell to ring. "Let's get this over with, Mr. Harrison," Richard sighed, checking a heavy gold Patek Philippe watch. "I have a board meeting at 2. Mr. Harrison, a frail attorney with a permanently apologetic expression, cleared his throat and adjusted his spectacles. He looked down at the last will and testament of Thomas Sullivan. Thomas had been the black sheep of the Sullivan family. While Richard had taken their father's modest real estate portfolio and ruthlessly expanded it into a multi-million-dollar empire, Thomas had dropped out, chased wild conspiracy theories, and alienated almost everyone. To Arthur and Leo, however, he had just been Dad, a chaotic, deeply flawed but intensely loving father who was always working on some big project that never seemed to pan out. "Very well," Mr. Harrison said, his voice a dry rasp. "We come to the division of assets. To his brother, Richard Sullivan, Thomas leaves his 40% stake in the Sullivan Family Trust, as well as the commercial properties located in the Low-Dough district, citing Richard's superior capability to manage concrete and glass." Leo let out a harsh, bitter laugh. "Wait, he gave the trust to him? Dad hated Richard." "Dad was drowning in debt, Leo," Arthur muttered, staring a hole into the carpet. "He probably leveraged the trust years ago and Richard bought out his debts. Right, Uncle Richard?" Richard offered a thin, razor-sharp smile. "Your father was a complicated man, Arthur. He understood that certain assets belong in the hands of those who can cultivate them. He owed me quite a bit of money. This simply balances the ledger." Mr. Harrison tapped the desk to regain control of the room. "Please, gentlemen." To his sons, Arthur and Leo Sullivan, Thomas leaves the entirety of his sole remaining independent asset: the property and business known as Sullivan & Sons Salvage, located on Route 85, including all inventory, equipment, and attached liabilities. Silence hung in the room, heavy and suffocating. "A junkyard," Leo said, his voice barely a whisper. "He left us a literal junkyard. 12 acres of it, to be exact," Mr. Harrison confirmed, pushing a thick manila folder across the desk. "I must warn you, boys, the property carries roughly $40,000 in back property taxes. Furthermore, the EPA has issued 2 preliminary warnings regarding soil contamination from leaking battery acid and motor oil. It is, from a financial standpoint, a severe liability." Arthur closed his eyes. The exhaustion of the last 3 weeks crashed down on him. They had barely managed to scrape together the funds for their father's modest funeral. They were living in a cramped one-bedroom apartment, working grueling night shifts at a logistics warehouse just to keep the lights on. They hadn't expected a massive windfall. They knew their father was eccentric and broke. But this felt like a cruel joke, a mountain of rusted metal and a crippling tax debt. "Well," Richard said, standing up and buttoning his suit jacket, "it's a tragic end to a wasted life. But I'm sure you boys will make the most of your scrap. If you find yourselves desperate, call my assistant. I might be willing to pay the back taxes in exchange for the deed, just to keep the Sullivan name out of the bankruptcy courts." He didn't wait for a reply. Richard swept out of the room, leaving the twins alone with the attorney and the overwhelming weight of their father's failure. 2 hours later, Arthur and Leo stood at the rusting chain-link gates of Sullivan & Son Salvage. The Denver sky had turned a bruised purple, and light snow was beginning to fall, dusting the jagged silhouettes of thousands of crushed cars, rotting washing machines, and twisted steel beams. Leo kicked the gate, the chain rattling aggressively. "This is it, Artie. This is our grand inheritance. A graveyard for forgotten garbage." Arthur unclipped a heavy ring of brass keys Mr. Harrison had given them and unlocked the padlock. The gates swung open with a shrieking groan. As they walked onto the property, the smell of oxidized iron, stagnant water, and ancient motor oil filled their lungs. It was a dystopian nightmare. Mountains of crushed sedans formed claustrophobic canyons. Feral cats darted between stacks of dry, rotted tires. In the center of the yard sat a dilapidated, single-story cinder block building with a faded sign that read, "Office." "We sell it," Leo said, his breath pluming in the freezing air. "We sell the scrap for whatever it's worth by the ton. We pay off the tax lien, and we walk away. I don't want to spend another second in this toxic dump." Arthur didn't answer immediately. He walked slowly toward the office, his boots crunching on glass and rusted bolts. Something gnawed at the back of his mind. His father was eccentric, yes. He was disorganized, absolutely. But Thomas Sullivan wasn't stupid. Before his downward spiral, Thomas had been a brilliant mechanical engineer. Why would a man who understood the intricate workings of complex machinery spend the last 15 years of his life hoarding worthless trash on the edge of the city? "Artie, you listening to me?" Leo snapped, catching up to him. "I hear you," Arthur said, pushing open the heavy metal door to the office. The hinges screamed in protest. "But let's just see what we're dealing with first." Inside, the office was exactly as Arthur remembered from his childhood, only layered in a decade's worth of dust. A stained Formica counter, a rusted cash register, and walls lined with grease-stained calendars and faded posters of classic cars. Behind the counter was a heavy oak desk, practically buried under stacks of unpaid bills, final notices, and greasy takeaway wrappers. Leo slumped into a torn vinyl chair, putting his head in his hands. He really left us nothing. Less than nothing. He left us a trap. Arthur walked behind the desk. He picked up a framed photograph that was lying face down. He wiped the grime away with his thumb. It was a picture of him, Leo, and their dad at a fishing trip when they were 10. Thomas was smiling, a wide, genuine grin, holding a tiny trout like it was a gold medal. Arthur's chest tightened. He loved us, Leo. I know he did. He wouldn't intentionally destroy our lives. "Love doesn't pay the EPA fines, Arthur," Leo shouted, his grief finally boiling over into raw anger. Richard walks away with millions, and we get tetanus. That's the reality. Arthur set the photo down. He looked out the filthy window at the endless sea of rusted metal fading into the twilight. Then we figure out a way out. Tomorrow, we start taking inventory. A week passed in a blur of freezing temperatures, cut hands, and mounting despair. The twins had systematically walked the 12 acres, attempting to catalogue the mountains of scrap. It was an impossible task. Most of the vehicles were stripped down to the chassis, stripped of anything valuable like catalytic converters or copper wiring. It was literally just worthless, low-grade steel and aluminum. By Thursday morning, Arthur was nursing a bitter cup of instant coffee in the freezing office when a pristine black Mercedes G-Wagon pulled up to the gates. The vehicle looked absurdly out of place against the backdrop of ruin. A man stepped out. He was dressed in a sharp overcoat and wore a fake, overly bright smile. He picked his way carefully through the mud, clearly disgusted by his surroundings, and entered the office. "Arthur and Leo Sullivan?" the man asked, handing over a glossy business card. "Gregory Finch, Acquisitions Director, Apex Holdings, LLC. What can we do for you?" Arthur asked, eyeing the man's immaculately polished Italian leather shoes. "I represent a consortium of commercial developers," Finch said smoothly, his eyes darting around the squalid office. "We are looking to acquire land in this corridor for a new logistics hub. Frankly, your property is a mess. The soil remediation alone will cost a fortune. However, we are willing to offer you a clean break." Leo sat up, suddenly interested. "What kind of break?" Finch smiled. "We will assume all liabilities, including the $40,000 tax lien and any pending EPA fines. Furthermore, we will cut you a check today for $100,000 cash. You sign the deed over, and you never have to look at this rust bucket again." Leo looked at Arthur, his eyes wide. 100 grand. Split 2 ways, it was 50,000 each. It was enough to get them out of debt, out of their terrible apartment, and give them a fresh start. "Where do we sign?" Leo asked eagerly. "Hold on," Arthur said, his voice sharp. He looked at Finch. "Apex Holdings. I'm not familiar with them." "We're a newly formed LLC," Finch replied smoothly, though a muscle feathered in his jaw. "Moving fast to secure real estate." Arthur stared at Finch. He noticed the watch on Finch's wrist. It wasn't just a nice watch. It was a Patek Philippe, the exact same rare vintage model Uncle Richard wore. Arthur's mind raced. Richard had casually mentioned buying the deed during the will reading. Now, an aggressive buyer shows up a week later with an LLC that has no footprint, wearing a watch that costs more than the land was supposedly worth, offering to wipe away their problems instantly. "No," Arthur said. "Artie, what are you doing?" Leo hissed, grabbing his brother's arm. "I said no, Mr. Finch," Arthur repeated, standing up. "The land isn't for sale." Finch's pleasant facade vanished instantly, replaced by a cold, hard glare. "You're making a mistake, son. This place is going to bankrupt you. By next month, the city will seize it anyway. Take the money." "Get off our property," Arthur demanded. Finch sneered, adjusted his coat, and walked out without another word. The G-Wagon sped off, throwing gravel into the air. "Are you out of your mind?" Leo exploded the second the door shut. "That was our way out. Why would you turn down 100 grand for a toxic wasteland?" "Because Finch works for Richard," Arthur said, turning to the desk. "I'm sure of it. And Richard doesn't do favors. Richard doesn't pay a premium for toxic land unless there's something on this land worth 10 times what he's paying." Leo frowned, his anger faltering as his brother's logic took hold. "But we've walked the whole yard. There's nothing here but rust and rats." "We missed something," Arthur said, his eyes scanning the chaotic office. "Dad hid something, or he built something." Arthur began tearing through the desk with renewed frenzy. He threw old receipts, faded magazines, and empty envelopes onto the floor. "Help me look. Look for ledgers, blueprints, anything that doesn't make sense." For 3 hours they scoured the office. They ripped away the old calendars and checked behind the filing cabinets. It wasn't until Leo was moving a heavy, rusted metal tool cabinet that he noticed a false panel on the back. "Artie," Leo called out, his voice tight. "Look at this." Leo pried the thin sheet metal away with a crowbar. Behind it was a hidden compartment containing a single, heavy leather-bound ledger and a thick roll of drafting paper. Arthur grabbed the ledger and flipped it open. It wasn't a record of scrap metal sales. It was a meticulously detailed log of electrical consumption and structural engineering notes. "Look at these numbers," Arthur pointed to a column. He was drawing thousands of kilowatts of power every month. From where? The office only has 2 strip lights and a space heater. And look at the bills. They were being paid by a dummy corporation out of Nevada. Leo unrolled the drafting paper across the dusty desk. It was a topographical map of Sullivan and Sons salvage, heavily annotated in their father's erratic, left-handed scrawl. But it wasn't just the surface. "Sector 1, Sector 2, Sector 3, Leo read aloud, tracing circles drawn over the piles of junk. Then his finger stopped near the back of the property, an area heavily fortified by a massive wall of crushed 1980s school buses. Beneath the drawing of the buses, Thomas had drawn a large rectangular space deep underground. It was labeled The Vault, Sub-Level 4. The twins locked eyes. Without a word, they grabbed heavy-duty flashlights and a pair of crowbars and bolted out of the office. They ran through the freezing mud, slipping and sliding past the rusted canyons until they reached the back of the lot. The wall of crushed yellow school buses loomed over them, standing at least 30 feet high, woven together with thick steel cables. It looked like a permanent structural boundary, a dead end. "The map says the entrance is right here," Arthur said, shining his light at the base of the buses. The ground was covered in overgrown weeds and rusted hubcaps. "We have to move them," Leo said, looking around. He spotted the yard's old, diesel-chugging Komatsu excavator sitting a few yards away. "I think I can hotwire the excavator. Dad showed me how when I was a kid." It took Leo 20 agonizing minutes of splicing wires and praying to coax the ancient excavator to life. With a deafening roar and a plume of black smoke, the massive machine lurched forward. Arthur directed Leo, signaling him to hook the excavator's heavy claw onto the steel cables, binding the bottom bus. "Pull!" Arthur shouted over the engine roar. Leo threw the lever. The excavator groaned, its treads biting deep into the mud. For a terrifying moment, the towering wall of buses swayed precariously, threatening to collapse and crush them both. Then, with a horrific screech of tearing metal, the bottom bus was dragged violently to the left. As the massive chunk of metal was ripped away, a cloud of dust and debris billowed into the air. Arthur waved the dust away, stepping forward with his flashlight. His breath hitched in his throat. Hidden behind where the bus had been was not mud or dirt, but a massive, poured concrete retaining wall. Embedded directly in the center of the concrete was a pair of heavy, military-grade steel blast doors. They were completely devoid of rust, painted a dull, industrial gray, and secured by a high-tech biometric and digital keypad lock that glowed with a faint red light. It was totally incongruous with the decaying world above. It looked like the entrance to a nuclear bunker. Leo killed the excavator engine and jumped down, running over to stand beside his brother. The absolute silence of the junkyard rushed back in, broken only by their heavy breathing. "What in the hell was Dad doing down here?" Leo whispered, staring at the glowing red keypad. Arthur stepped closer. He looked down at his father's leather ledger, flipping to the very last page. Scrawled in the corner, almost as an afterthought, was a string of 8 numbers. November 4th, 1992. "Our birthday," Arthur said quietly. He reached out, his hand trembling slightly, and punched the numbers into the keypad. Beep, 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 beep. The red light turned a solid, vibrant green. Deep within the earth, a massive series of mechanized deadbolts engaged. A heavy, resounding clank echoed through the concrete, shaking the ground beneath their feet as the impenetrable doors hissed, unsealed, and slowly began to swing inward into the pitch-black abyss below. Cold, aggressively filtered air rushed out of the darkness, carrying the distinct, sterile scent of ozone and high-end electronics. It was a smell that belonged in a Silicon Valley laboratory, not buried beneath 12 acres of rotting Detroit steel. Arthur and Leo stood paralyzed at the threshold. As the heavy blast doors locked into their fully open position, a bank of motion sensors triggered. Deep within the earth, a cascade of brilliant white LED lights slammed on, illuminating a pristine, reinforced concrete stairwell that plunged down into the bedrock. "We're going in," Arthur said, his voice echoing slightly in the vast, subterranean silence. They descended cautiously, their crowbars held tight. The stairs seemed to go on forever, spiraling past thick pipes labeled with hazard warnings for liquid nitrogen cooling systems. Finally, they reached the bottom. Stepping through a second set of doors into an observation deck overlooking a cavernous space that defied all logic. Leo dropped his flashlight. It clattered loudly against the reinforced glass floor. "Artie, what is this?" Below them was a massive, football field-sized server farm. Row upon row of sleek, black, monolithic data towers hummed with a quiet, terrifying power. The towers were submerged in specialized liquid cooling tanks, bubbling gently, glowing with pulsing blue and green fiber optic indicators. The sheer scale of the infrastructure was staggering. Thomas Sullivan hadn't been hoarding junk. He had been building a fortress. The thousands of tons of rusted cursant school buses above weren't just camouflage. They were a massive, improvised Faraday cage designed to shield this underground facility from electromagnetic pulses and mask its immense thermal signature from satellite surveillance. Arthur bolted down the final flight of stairs to the main floor, navigating the aisles of servers until he reached a glass-enclosed command center in the middle of the room. Inside sat a massive curved desk featuring a multi-monitor workstation. He tapped the spacebar on the keyboard. Instantly, the screens flared to life. There were no passwords. A pre-recorded video file immediately popped up on the center screen. The thumbnail was an image of Thomas Sullivan, looking tired but fiercely proud, sitting in this exact chair. Arthur's breath caught in his throat. He clicked play. "If you're watching this, boys," their father's voice crackled through the high-fidelity speakers, "it means Richard finally made his move, and I didn't survive it." Leo stepped into the room, staring at the screen in horror. "Did he just say, 'I didn't die in a random crash, boys'?" Thomas continued, rubbing his grease-stained hands over his face. My brakes were compromised. I've known Richard was tapping my phones for months. He thinks I'm a fool, an eccentric loser. He doesn't understand what I've built. Thomas leaned into the camera, his eyes burning with an intense, lucid brilliance. Data is the new oil, but the current grids are vulnerable, centralized and monitored. What I built down here is the Aegis Protocol, the world's first fully autonomous, unhackable, decentralized quantum-encrypted data haven. It's completely off-grid, powered by a geothermal tap I drilled myself. Arthur's eyes drifted from the screen to the desk. Lying next to the keyboard was a thick, leather-bound portfolio. He opened it. Inside was a finalized term sheet and a heavily redacted non-disclosure agreement. Arthur's eyes widened as he read the signature at the bottom. It was signed by Peter Thiel, the legendary billionaire venture capitalist and co-founder of Palantir. I secured a private contract with Founders Fund last month, Thomas's video continued. The initial valuation for the Aegis network is $1.2 billion, Richard found out. He couldn't steal the code because it's biometrically locked to our bloodline. He had to get rid of me, take the land, and force you two to sell it to his dummy corporation before you ever knew what was beneath your feet. Thomas smiled, a sad, loving smile. You own it now. The servers, the patents, the contract. Finish the deal. Ruin my brother. I love you both. The video faded to black. The silence in the command center was deafening. The twins stood perfectly still, the weight of their father's genius and his murder crashing over them in a tidal wave of grief and fury. They weren't the heirs to a toxic junkyard. They were the sole proprietors of a billion-dollar tech empire. Leo's fists clenched so hard his knuckles popped. The volatile energy that usually controlled him was gone, replaced by a cold, terrifying stillness. He killed our dad for this. Arthur picked up the Founders Fund contract, carefully rolling it up. His pragmatism, usually a shield against disappointment, sharpened into a lethal weapon. Richard thought he was playing chess against a dead man, Arthur said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. He forgot Dad left 2 knights on the board. Let's go make a phone call. At 8 a.m. on Monday, a convoy of 3 sleek black SUVs pulled up to the rusted gates of Sullivan & Sons Salvage. Uncle Richard stepped out of the lead vehicle, wrapped in a cashmere overcoat, flanked by Gregory Finch and 4 heavily built men wearing tactical earpieces. Richard looked thoroughly annoyed. He had expected the twins to cash his meager check days ago. Now, he was here to force the issue. Armed with a fraudulent environmental injunction he had bribed a local judge to sign. He expected to find his nephews freezing, defeated, and desperate. Instead, he found the gates wide open. Arthur and Leo stood side by side in the center of the muddy yard. They weren't wearing their frayed denim jackets anymore. They wore sharply tailored, dark suits. Behind them stood an imposing, silver-haired man, flanked by 2 men in federal windbreakers. Richard's confident stride faltered slightly, but he forced a patronizing smile. Arthur. Leo. Playing dress-up, I see. I'm afraid playtime is over. I have a court order declaring this site a biohazard. You are vacating the premises immediately. Good morning, Richard, Arthur called out, his voice ringing clearly over the biting wind. He didn't say uncle. Finch stepped forward, sneering. You heard him, kid. Take the $100 grand we offered, or walk away with nothing. We actually had a counter-offer. Leo smiled, a feral, terrifying grin. Arthur pulled a sleek tablet from his jacket. We accessed sub-level 4, Richard. We saw the servers. We watched the video. And most importantly, we saw the data logs. Richard's face drained of color. The arrogant sneer vanished, replaced by an expression of stark terror. You couldn't have. It was sealed. Dad knew you were wiretapping him, Arthur continued, taking a slow step forward. But you didn't realize his servers were running counter-surveillance on your network. We have every encrypted email, every offshore bank transfer, and the audio files of you hiring the mechanic who cut Dad's brake lines. Finch instinctively took a step back, suddenly realizing he was standing on the wrong side of a very dangerous line. "You're lying," Richard choked out, though his trembling hands betrayed him. "This is a bluff." "I assure you, Mr. Sullivan, it is no bluff," the silver-haired man behind the twins spoke up. He stepped forward, flashing a gold badge. "Special Agent Vance, FBI Cyber Crimes Division. Your nephews provided us with heavily encrypted packets last night. It took our techs hours to unpack them, but the evidence of corporate espionage and conspiracy to commit murder is quite comprehensive." Richard staggered backward, bumping into the side of his SUV. His private security team, realizing federal agents were present, collectively raised their hands and backed away from their employer. "Oh, and Richard?" Arthur added, his voice dripping with quiet vengeance. "I spoke with Peter Thiel's representatives yesterday. The Aegis Protocol deal went through at a $1.5 billion valuation. We used the first tranche of funding to do exactly what you would have done." Richard looked up, his eyes wide, hyperventilating. "What did you do?" "We bought your debt," Leo answered smoothly. "All those commercial properties in Lodo. The glass and concrete you're so proud of. You're over-leveraged, Richard. We own your notes now, and we are calling them in today. You are bankrupt, defeated, humiliated, and facing the rest of his life in a federal penitentiary. Richard collapsed to his knees in the freezing mud of the junkyard he had killed his brother to steal. The federal agents moved in, slapping cold steel handcuffs onto his wrists. Arthur and Leo watched in silence as the SUVs were driven away, taking the last remnant of their family's poison with them. The wind howled through the canyons of rusted metal, but for the first time in their lives, it didn't feel cold. It felt like a fresh start. The twins turned their backs on the empty gates and walked back toward the dilapidated cinderblock office. They would keep the junkyard exactly as it was, a monument of rust and ruin hiding a secret impulse of wealth, standing as a testament to the father who outsmarted them all. If this story of the Sullivan twins' incredible rise from a rusted junkyard to an underground tech empire kept you on the edge of your seat, hit that like button. Don't forget to share this video with someone who loves a brilliant plot twist and a massive dose of billionaire revenge. Subscribe to our channel and ring the bell so you never miss another dramatic, real-life inspired tale. What would you do if you found a secret bunker? Comment down below.